I'm Hannah Donnett with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnership calls and webinars, science serves, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's partnership webinar, which is titled Seeds of Health, Safer Soils for Growing Food. Our moderator today is Wendy Heiger-Bernays, Research Translation Core Leader of the Boston University Superfund Research Program. We will leave time following the presentation for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions through the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your window at any point during the presentation. Additionally, we will have a chat feature open for those of you who would like to chat with our speakers. Feel free to send a note or a question that way as well. After the presentation, our moderator will read out questions for our presenters to respond to, and we'll also have a panel discussion. We will get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period. For those of you who called in on the phone, we have posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone in the webinar right now is muted with the exception of our moderator and our speakers. This webinar is scheduled to last for 60 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. With that, I'll turn things over to you, Wendy.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Welcome. This is the final call in a series that has been co-organized and hosted by Collaborative for Health and Environment and the Boston University Superfund Research Program, which is funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Science. The Superfund Research Program is a multidisciplinary program with centers around the country, and each center conducts and communicates research with the goal of breaking the link between environmental exposures and disease. This research program is truly unique in that it has always emphasized solution-oriented, multidisciplinary approaches, research translation, and community engagement. I'm formally recognizing that our CHE webinars have been organized by our colleague Maria Valenti, who throughout her career has tirelessly developed and disseminated environmental health education materials and training programs with a number of organizations. And she is now as Director of Health Environment Literacy Project with Commonweal. I thank Maria for her commitment to improving health across the lifespan, for making sure that our webinars are timely, and for keeping me focused on gearing our webinars for the regular person who is left to make decisions for themselves and their communities when government and other structures fall short. So thank you, Maria. Today we are discussing soils, since the soil is the foundation, where the roots are, where our roots are. Safe and healthy soils are keys to healthy gardening. When Maria asked me about the work that I began about 15 years ago on soils and gardening, I thought, wow, we just did a webinar about 6 years ago. Is the science really changing this quickly? Yes and no. We both agreed that we're in a different place right now. This past year has brought sickness, death, heartache, despair, highlighted the social and environmental injustices and inequities. We need something to lift us all. What better than to head outdoors to leverage the benefits of gardening and growing food locally? So here we are. Today, we will hear from Dr. Patrick Drohan, an Associate Professor of Pedology, Soil Science in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management at Pennsylvania State University. His research examines people's use of landscapes and the accompanying changes in soil function across larger ecosystems the soil supports. He will share some of the practical side of his work, and he works closely with John Spargo, soil scientist, who's the director of the Penn State Agricultural Analytical Services Laboratory, and who previously was director of the University of Massachusetts Extension Service Soils Laboratory when we began working on lead contamination in community garden soils. We will then hear from Vidya Tiku, Director for Greater Boston with the Trustees. She oversees a network of culturally diverse and highly active community gardens in Boston, each of which is critical to improvement of health and well-being of the people. Both of these speakers brings real-world experience to improving the safety and productivity of soils for growing food. As Hannah mentioned, we will be asking for a very short evaluation survey after the call, which will help tailor future calls. So please take the time to respond. So over the past 15 years or so, and even more so during the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a resurgence in the growing of food locally. Gardening and growing food has many benefits, supported by an ever increasing literature, some of which can be easily quantified and others that are assessed qualitatively. Some of the benefits are to the individual, such as fresh produce, physical activity, gaining skills, and ability to can and freeze foods for consumption throughout the year. The communities in which gardening occurs have benefited from increases in social cohesion, increased property values, and greater food security. Many communities partner with organizations, including hospitals, to provide food to food banks and pantries. Schools have initiated gardens on site to facilitate learning on food, food choices, nutrition, history, science, and math. As we look to increase people's ability to participate in gardening activities, we recognize that many of the parcels of land on which growing is possible are located on properties that have been subject to contamination over the years. Many of the contaminants are studied in the NIEHS funded Superfund research programs. These contaminants include lead, arsenic, and depending upon where the garden is located, may include persistent pollutants such as pesticides and now PFAS. There are common practices that add contaminants to soils, use of pesticides, and application of unsafe soils and amendments. In addition to decreasing exposure to these chemical contaminants, we must pay attention to detrimental growing conditions. So it's a balance. We need nutrients and physical structure to the soil, but we need to limit those chemical contaminants. So today we're discussing what my colleagues and I have learned about soils with an explicit goal of providing practices that encourage gardening and consuming of the food grown in those gardens. And because we frame this conversation in the context of decreasing risk while increasing benefit, we think about the role of soil as the growing medium, but we are in direct contact with the soil while we garden, perhaps inadvertently putting that soil on our hands and in our mouths. Well, we thought that inhaling dust that were generated from soils contributes to this exposure. The data suggest otherwise, that it's really not the driver. We can also ingest contaminants and soil that deposit on the plant while the plant grows. And there's evidence that some contaminants, to some degree, can be taken up by some plants. For the metals studied, particularly lead and arsenic, the data suggest a fraction of the amount ingested is actually absorbed. But since we don't measure all the potential hazards, we need to decrease the total exposure to maximize the benefits of growing food locally. So, two flavors of gardens that we're going to talk about: community gardens and backyard gardens. And our speakers will focus on a little bit of both. And we know that these are two sort of different types of gardens. But growing food is not new. It's actually old. We must share what we've learned and reiterate some of the challenges to improving soil health in order to improve human health. So, for example, even though we think we've been doing this for so long, we learn that sometimes organizations forget. For example, I was just contacted earlier this week about communities that have started putting street sweepings back into their composting material. So very relevant as we move forward. We're leaving here sort of the basics of good gardening practices. And I'm going to turn this over now to Patrick.
Great. While Patrick is pulling up his slides, I just like to remind our audience to feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A now, and we'll get to them after the panel discussion. And the chat feature is also open for you guys to use to speak to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy and Hannah. So when you're first looking at an option to install some type of gardening operation, well, the primary concern to support your planting medium is going to be what's the condition of the site. And this begins with a site evaluation. Thinking about what the soils are going to be like that are going to be supporting our operation is key here. And in these urban areas, we typically will encounter two kinds of soil situations. The first is where we have a natural soil that's disturbed by people. And in this case, the natural soil is here at the lower part of the picture in both of these profiles. And the material you have on top is fill material that's brought in to level the site or to cap construction debris that came from a house that was being leveled. Then you can have entirely new soil systems that are manufactured, where specification is designed to meet a certain particle size composition of sands, usually are the dominant class, maybe a very small percentage of silt and clay, typically less than 10%. Design soils are usually reserved for more intense horticultural operations. Most of the time, what you're dealing with in these urban gardening situations is some type of former natural soil with some type of disturbance signature, we call it. And sometimes those materials that are used as fill material on a site are fairly clean materials, like you see here. These are just local soil materials that were used as fill, and there was pretty strict regulation of what those materials could consist of. In other cases, you could have some construction debris in here from the former house that could actually have some contaminants that could cause some health effects if those are exposed or ingested. The interaction with the water table too could be a problem here because the leaching of contaminants out of these buried materials. The number one characteristic that gives you a clue you have a situation where you have some type of disturbed soil environment is typically going to be some evidence of a very stark boundary, like you see in each of these cases. These three cores were taken in urban areas, where former housing sites were, and you can see each core has different signatures of the former housing environment. You can see materials from construction debris from the house, in this case a relic cinder block. You can see brick materials here. This is wood ash from when the house area was burning wood for heat. This is another area of wood ash here. The number one clue, again, is going to be these abrupt boundaries. You typically won't see these in many natural soils. To be more of a gradual boundary. Evidence of artifacts will be a primary concern too. So here's a typical site. You've just inherited this. You're wondering what you can do with it. When I advise on projects, I take people through a site evaluation process where we're doing a site assessment. And this will include thinking about your project, what its goals are, who's going to use the data that's being collected for meeting this goal or even beyond. There might be other uses that come up down the road. Another concern will be who's responsible for that data and its quality. Is there an actual liability for what information is collected and how that information is shared? If that information is shared and someone uses it incorrectly, does the organization that collected that data hold a liability? This is why some cities like Philadelphia have set up soil safety working groups. And then who has control of the information beyond the project? Last, in this capacity, we want to think about who is being sure that the data being collected is being entered correctly, that the data is actually meaningful data that we can use to make a decision. We typically refer to this as a quality assurance, quality control step. These are all different types of sites you might encounter. And in each one of these situations, you would have different aspects of a site that might result in different parameters you have to pay attention to. Some of those parameters might deal with surface compaction. Some might deal with contaminants tied to debris on the site. Some might deal with surface topography issues that could present the problem for water management on the site. And others are hidden concerns that you don't even see until you start digging a soil pit to evaluate the soils for their suitability in the garden. Some sites can be fairly large, like this one in Pittsburgh. This was an area of an actual neighborhood in the Hilltop Alliance area in southwest Pittsburgh. St. Clair Village was what the housing development was formerly called. And today this is being turned into a large urban agricultural operation for that neighborhood. When you're first investigating sites like this, it can be challenging to figure out how soils are going to be sampled or where you should even sample, especially if there's existing infrastructure left on the site, right? Or materials you have to go through that could present a challenge for excavation, like through this old road on the site. You can also see some of this infrastructure is still existing on the site that could pose a problem to below ground excavation, like former fire hydrants. primary question here that several of you might be wondering is, are these power lines still active? Those are all important questions to be thinking about as you go into thinking about how you're going to utilize this site to produce food for the community. So typically when we are thinking at the project level, whether it's a small community lot or a larger area of a neighborhood, we're typically looking at the landscape surface topography, and this can be derived, information can be derived on this from old USGS quadrangle maps from the topographic survey, or more modern digital elevation models, maybe even data produced from high resolution LiDAR information. The material the soil is made from is very important. We call this parent material, and a soil scientist can work with you in a local soil and water conservation district to help you identify that information. And then the type of rock in the area underlying the city can be very important in terms of influencing the site's capability for supporting food. A lot of times your urban lot that you're considering evolved with the city over time, and it may be inheriting a cocktail of pollutants or contaminants that you don't desire because of that city's evolution over time. And so you want to think about where your lot is in relation to the bigger city. One thing we often use are what are called these Sanborn fire insurance maps, which are really nice records of the historical city's evolution over time. You also want to think about the cultural community development over time, because that may be important in imparting certain values within that community, which may dictate how that lot is desired to be used. That can be culturally specific to ethnic or even religious groups. When you do your site assessment and are looking at the historical reconstruction in the area where your project is, you want to look for areas that were hotspots through time, areas where there was leather tanning going on, or formal railroad yards, or factories, or warehouses, former hospitals. You'd be surprised what might have been a hospital in the past that today you're now building your food garden on, or even a slaughterhouse or shipping area, loading dock, etc. The historic soil distribution is important too. A lot of times when you look within the soil survey information provided by USDA, there isn't very detailed information on what's there. It's just labeled as urban land. But sometimes you'll see what was there prior to the city's development. And in places you can still find that material. That is very valuable for giving you an idea of what the subsoil characteristics are. And tied to that data are going to be specific parameters you can use, like the depth of certain soils, or the thickness of certain horizons, the general particle size, or the soil pH. And then you want to look in relation to the topography data you're collecting, what the historic drainage in the area was, and how the city over time developed infrastructure to move that water, what we call conveyances, like sewer lines, sewer systems in the city's area, open sewer systems even. And then another important aspect is going to be looking at those historic wind patterns in the sea. As the city is evolving over time and buildings are getting taller, little microclimates within that city are going to shift, and those can affect your site. Excess winds can cause excess evapotranspiration, making it harder to keep plants in a state that's moistened where they can get those required nutrients from the soil for growth. As you're moving through deciding how to use that lot, you want to be careful of liability and permission for access. Who's going to be responsible in your organization for acquiring those permissions for site access? Who's going to make the calls to make sure there isn't something below ground that can kill you if you dig a hole? In Pennsylvania, we have the 811 system, where you have to call a number, provide a location. Utility companies will then report back to you if there's a gas line or a water line or electrical line below ground in the area where you're digging. Is there a risk to digging where you can be sued, or is there a liability if you hit something like a fiber optic line, which then results in Southwest Pittsburgh losing all of its telecommunications for a day? That could result in some really bad PR for your urban gardening operation. Do you need police services for protection or security? This is not something that most people think about. Sometimes good deeds can lead to vandalism. Simply talking to the police department and asking them to come by more frequently can be helpful. Or if you're moving to an area where there are some people who don't want that lot used for your purpose that you've been given permission to use it for, there might be a conflict there in the neighborhood. These can be head off ahead of time with good communication in that neighborhood, but sometimes having the police services there or aware of what you're doing can be very valuable. When you're deciding then what your use is going to be and how you're going to bring about this gardening project, you want to be very specific in targeting your soil testing to the question at hand. You can spend an awful lot of money testing soils for things you don't need to. You want to be able to talk to folks that are going to give you good advice on what the minimum data set that is you need to collect in terms to make sure that site's safe, and then what the amendments you need to add to those soils are in order to make that soil viable. And a lot of times this comes down to the question of how are we going to examine our soils on this site? You know, how should the soils be examined versus what can I afford to do to examine them? So here we are back at our site down in Southwest Pittsburgh. This is the Hilltop Alliance site. And this is another perspective of that project site where we see these down power lines. These power lines were turned off and the owners of this gardening project were given permission to take these power lines down. But when they did, they actually did shut off power to a cell tower at the back end of the lot that was being leased by a telecommunications company in Pittsburgh. What the telecommunications company had done to save money was they ran a telecommunications line along the old power lines to their cell tower without having to dig a new line below ground, which would have been far more expensive. They just didn't tell anyone they did this though. So when the Urban Gardening Association took these power lines down, they literally cut off cell service to Southwest Pittsburgh. And within minutes, numerous police cars, fire department had showed up. The police thought there was a terrorist incident going on. So you really want to be thinking about your site and how you're going to approach using the site before you even start excavating that hole. When you go in to evaluate a site, you can do things very cost effectively by using hand augering or hand dug holes, or you can get more expensive and use devices that take cores from the soils, or maybe even a backhoe investigation. Most of the time, simple soil sampling in the lot with hand tools is sufficient. And then you want to know what you're looking at so you know how to sample it appropriately. Most soil labs in the United States will give you good advice on how you should sample your soils. If you need to go further and understand what it is you're looking at, there are many soil scientists in the local soil and water conservation district offices or NRCS USDA offices who can help guide you. And then you want to understand how you're going to recover that site after you've done all this excavation work. It's a liability, leave holes open. A lot of children love to play in areas like this, and you don't want someone running across this area and fall into an open soil pit. That actually can happen quite often. You'd be surprised. We often have it happen even in rural areas with deer. As we're looking at this broader site assessment process, we also want to think of the physical data we're collecting. Do we need any type of data on how water is moving in our soil so we avoid situations with ponding, or even subsoil horizons where we might have water held up and cause an area of the soil to become wetter than we desire? Do we want to look at particle size distributions, what the USDA calls soil textures, or do we have to do something more like what engineers use, which is the Unified Soil Classification System? These different systems have different purposes, but different communities that work with soils in urban areas will talk different languages sometimes. And then the chemical data is where things can get very, very complicated. Simple fertility tests most of the time will run you somewhere around $9 a sample and give you basic information on pH and available ions, some amendments you might need to apply. If you get into testing for exposure risk to humans, where you're looking at total elemental or even volatile organic carbon, volatile organics, you can get exceedingly expensive and run up a very steep budget very quickly. And then sampling will become an important aspect that you'll want to be thinking about. You can go with very intense sampling designs, which are very, very costly. Purely random designs can be very risky because you can miss areas of interest. What we will typically recommend is a stratified random approach where you're isolating areas of your operation with the most intense sampling, leaving other areas to lesser intense sampling. So you can see our gardening operation would most likely come into this area, and we're focusing our intensity of sampling there in a grid pattern, and we can do some nice mapping of that data afterwards. And then last, one of the other aspects that people forget to think about is the heat profile in the city will change dramatically over the course of the year. And you know, here's a nice garden situation in Philadelphia with a beautiful mural. mural. But one of the problems that they encountered in this gardening operation was afternoon sun was limited, which caused the garden to lose productivity in about 3/4 of the lot. So instead of using this as a site that presented a challenge for productivity, they actually turned that other 3/4 of this lot into a beautiful sitting area with an outdoor kitchen. So other tests you might want to keep in mind down the road would be specific things looking at the soil mineralogy or the chemistry, where you're actually more concerned about a total elemental analysis. So this would be where you're looking at your lead or your arsenic testing. And you can do screening analysis using tools like X-ray fluorescence or Melick-3 analysis, which is your standard fertility test we use in the East. That's your typical fertility extractant, versus more specific US EPA methodologies that get at what would be defined as exposure limitations once you get a result from a lab. And then sometimes you're going to be paying attention maybe to what engineers called soil mechanic variables. These are probably not terms you've heard of before, but they might become important if your site has a load bearing issue. If for some reason you have soils that can't support the weight of the project that you want to use on that site, you might have soils that are too soft to bring vehicles into. Those vehicles could become stuck over time. And then last, sometimes you can find a local university that has access to geophysics equipment like ground penetrating radar, which can actually give you a lot of really useful information about below ground disturbances and where you might have buried artifacts. So now we'll transition to video.
Great, thank you so much, Patrick. While we're waiting for video to pull up our slides, I just want to remind you again, feel free to put in some questions in the Q&A. We have a lot of chats going on, but the Q&A, if you have any questions you want to be asked live, feel free to put those in there. All right, thanks so much. And video will be right with you in a moment. She's just pulling up her slides now.
Thank you. Yes, it'll just take me 1 minute to get started. Hopefully everybody can see my screen.
We can see it. I think we just need the, yeah, beautiful.
There you go. All right, folks. So a little bit on the consumer side. Thank you for having me. And I will be talking about community gardens and our amazing partnership with the BU School of Public Health and Wendy, which is why I'm here today. So a quick shot. I don't know how familiar everybody might be here with community gardens. Hopefully you've all been in one or are community gardeners or know of somebody who is one. This is just a shot of one of our bigger gardens in Boston, the Berkeley Garden in the South End. So this is, the Trustees is the largest owner of community gardens in Boston. We own and operate 56 of them. There are nearly 200 gardens in the city, and we do provide stewardship for all of them. Just to give you a scale of what is here, there are about 4,000 garden plots that are feeding fresh food to about 16,000 individuals, plus the food that gets donated, of course, is in addition. There are about 18,000 people that participate in our annual programming around education. That includes compost and healthy soil and healthy eating. And to know that it's not just the 4,000 individuals or the 16,000 people eating out of these gardens, but really there's 125,000 people in the city of Boston that live within a quarter mile of these 56 gardens. So, when we do education and we talk compost and healthy soil, that's really the audience we're talking about. As the landowner and the lead education organization for these community gardens, our primary investment is obviously in the land and the community itself. We bring permanent protection to these parcels, and we invest funds to make sure that they look permanent. That is very important in a city like Boston, where land is much in demand. The investment in land, obviously, this is the Minton Stables Garden in JP now, what it used to look like. This was a parcel vacant lying with the city. We took it over for, I think, $5. invested some funds, and here's what it looks like now. I had plenty of befores and afters, but Wendy pulled me back. So it really, this is really an investment in the neighborhood, in the different cultures. Every garden has anywhere from, I would say 10 to 15 languages being spoken here. And so any and all conversations around soil do need to bring in all those different languages and cultures, and it can be trying. I still haven't found a way to get the word compost through to in multiple languages. Um, our other biggest investment, obviously, is in the leadership. This is an event we just hosted. This was from a couple of years ago with the mayor, Mayor Walsh. This is the Gardeners Gathering, what I call the official kickoff for spring in the city of Boston. So it really is an investment that we have to put in to make sure that we get the essential services that the network, the full network of 200 community gardens received from the city. Back with Mayor Menino, when he was around, you know, he invested heavily as a city, and we're lucky. And he promised free tested compost for all the community gardens in the city, and we're grateful for it. It needs annual monitoring. It needs annual advocacy. You want to make sure the services continue. You want to make sure that the city is leading this, and the soil is getting tested. But this does involve spending considerable time building these strong relationships with City Hall, our neighborhood liaisons, the counselors, etc., as well as the contractor, obviously. Um, I put the slide in. This was a project for the Nightingale Community Garden. In this case, there's Wendy on the left. The next guy over is Santos. He was the contractor 2 contractors ago with the city of Boston. And the contract in our city is managed by the DPW, of the Department of Public Works, and the staff is on the right. And I think this was a little education session we were having with Wendy. This is to say, I think this is really, really important that anybody who is considering these services and should be considering gets the investment from their public departments and the staff, who are often stretched, but can understand what it is from the professionals that they should be requiring of their contractors. It is not every day that every DPW staff person here will exactly know how to do the sampling or go through all the tests or the surveys that Patrick just spoke about. So this was our Q&A. You want to make sure you know which file you're getting it from, which site you're getting it from, who's pulling it, who's testing it, how are they testing it. So this is what was happening here. And that is some students, on the bottom right hand is something that comes in at Boston that includes the street sweepings. We're at a stage where I think DPW and the current contractor have basically said, street sweepings, we cannot promise you the compost quality that you require at this point. So they are now, since the last year, not including street sweepings at all in the compost that's being delivered. The impact of that is not all the compost that we now receive is being produced at within the city of Boston, which was one of the goals, reducing the waste in the city. But we are getting cleaner compost, I think, than 2 years ago. So some heavy lifting by the students there. We also do the testing, obviously, on the site. This is the Nightingale Garden. This is a former school site, and we worked with the Bureau School of Public Health to test, at different levels, at different spots. They did a historical review for us, just like Patrick was recommending, to make sure we know the past use, check for any fires, etc. I would say on the site, depending on the scale of your site, this can get considerably quite into an operation that looks like the compost city site. So I would say, again, as landowners, please make sure you're working with your neighbors and you are using this opportunity to educate the community and the future gardeners at this site. This is on a smaller scale. This is the Bromley Heath Garden in Jamaica Plain. This is before the gardeners come in, and then it is handed over to the community. Our next investment is the education piece. We host a number of compost turning days. We build compost bins and replace them ever so often in every community garden. We hold skill building workshops, and we host multiple compost building bins in multiple languages. This is one of them. We offer different models that different people, depending on how many gardeners there are. The gardens are really run by the gardeners. We're a staff of 4, so we offer guidelines, and then they build their own in addition. So, this is an example of how, let's say, a garden that has 100 individuals, can develop messages to manage their compost piles. And this is what that garden where you saw Wendy standing with her students looks like today. I think 133 garden plots, all growing food, every single one of them. We estimate there's about $1.4 million worth of fresh food, very conservatively, being grown in our community gardens. And we did work with Wendy and share our good gardening practices in multiple languages with many gardeners, for which we are very thankful. With that, I will hand it back to Wendy.
All right. Thank you, Vidya, and thank you, Patrick. I think what we will do now is to go through a sort of a panel discussion of some of the questions that have been raised by many backyard gardeners and community gardeners and community garden organizers. So let's start with Patrick. Let's see, how do I decide what the best, well, I'm actually doing a second one. I'd like to construct a garden at my home. Does it matter where I place it?
So a lot of times it will depend on the age of your home. In the United States, if your home was built before 1978, it's safe to assume there's lead paint somewhere around the property tied to the house. Even if the house wasn't built prior to 1978, if it was built close to 1978, there was still lead paint around people used. So you don't want to assume there wasn't lead paint on the house. It's very easy to test for lead paint with various types of test kits available at different hardware stores. But you would then want to be thinking about materials that might have fallen off the house, either as particulates of chips of paint or pieces of wood that came off the house. That material would have had lead particulates in it, and that lead accumulates in the soil. You also had leaded gasoline in the neighborhood, and small particles of that would have gotten into the atmosphere and fallen in urban areas. But immediate to the house, the concern is lead paint. And so if you move a distance away from the house, that lead paint signature will typically decline in the soil. So my sister had a house in Providence, Rhode Island, and her lead levels were 30 times higher than the US EPA minimum recommended action level. And that was only
minimum
about
recommended action level.
Yeah. And
So-
it was really, it was only a few feet away from the house. So do you panic? No. What you do is you don't use the soil on your property to grow, build above, build up. And there's lots of techniques out there on how to do that safely.
So I'll just extend that, Patrick. Thank you. We actually recommend 3 feet from the drip line of the house, which is where you might start, because even if you raise your beds in that close distance to the house, you will still have leaching off the house. And so you will continuously generate the lead into the soil. So away from the house, raising the bed, which gets us to bed dividers and raised beds. And Vidya, what do you now use for raised beds? So I'm going to go sort of one and then the other. So
Sure, if we can afford it, we usually use, cedar, staying away from any pressure treated lumber. As you know, the garden sometimes had railroad beds, which we have now all replaced. Same goes for the garden plot dividers. If we can afford it, we're going actually now with granite stone dividers, because these things are expensive. And every garden, I would say, has a cycle of about 15, 20 years where you have to reinvest, and having stone buys us more longevity.
Thank you. So that gets us to a question of where do I get my soil if I'm raising my bed, or if I'm even just going to bring soil in? Maybe start with Patrick. Can you buy soil? Should I accept donated soil?
So in the United States, we don't have regulations that dictate what is soil. If you go to Lowe's or Home Depot or Ace Hardware and you buy soil material, you're going to get a variety of products. Even if you look online in Craigslist and find soil available, you have to be very careful. It's the wild, wild west, literally, of soils out there when you're looking to acquire materials. And you can get scammed very easily. A common trick is to sell you a load of soil with water, because what you're paying for is the water and not the soil then, right? So even my university's been burned by that scam, but they're more careful now. So you put specifications in your purchase that you're desiring for some type of testing validation, that you trust the person selling this material, or you're given permission to test this material. And you really want to take a lot of caution thinking about where you're acquiring materials from if you're bringing new soil materials in.
Okay, and along the lines of, since this is really about soil, how do you define healthy soil for growing purposes?
So the most simplest definition for you is if you smell that soil and it smells decent, that's a good start. And if you don't believe me,
we're in the times of COVID.
Yeah,
smelling may not be a good.
So go to a big box store, find a soggy bag of soil, smell it, and you'll know what I mean right away. Beyond that simple test, you want a material that has a good dark color. You want a material that has fairly good distribution of particle sizes. For urban gardening, you want to lean a little bit towards the sandy side of things. There are very simple keys online to teach you how to do an assessment yourself of the approximate texture. You don't have to be perfect to get this right. I can teach third graders how to do this in a couple of minutes, and they can get within the ballpark. And then you want to really shoot at first, if you're going to get a soil test, for a pH range somewhere between 6 and 7. For most of what you're going to be growing, that's a safe pH range where you're not going to look at problems with fertility for what the plant needs. And then a lot of your heavy metals aren't going to be necessarily the biggest issue there either, because once you get into that neutral pH zone, heavy metals are less mobile in those soils, if they're there. Ideally, you're not working with soils that have those heavy metals to begin with. And then for the other healthy soil question, you're over time looking for structural development in that soil. You want to see those particles being held together in chunks that you can hold in your hand. You want to see roots growing in there. You want to see some type of earthworm population. Too many is not a good thing. So.
Okay, I'm going to shift
just really quickly. I just wanted to add that for sources, if your city is not running a facility that is accessible to you, which I would say again, local nonprofits in your region must be testing that soil, hopefully, and making sure it's available. But at least in Boston, and I know in Philly as well, the local community gardening organization, and in New York actually, they also have a back-end facility just like we do, and we do build compost on our sites. This is available in I would say 10 or 20 pound bags, no more. But if you just want it for your raised bed or just a topping, those are good sources as well.
Thank you. So one of the things that actually, I think this is a Patrick question, which is, what is the difference between a soil amendment and a soil additive?
Most of your amendments fall in the traditional range of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, lime. Soil additives are a relatively new concept. You can see people marketing biostimulants, folks will market, I wouldn't call compost teas an additive. Compost teas are an amendment. If they're made right, they can really be quite good. Additives generally fall in these conditioner realms. There's materials you can add that can help stabilize water holding capacity in the soil. They're used more out west, like polyacrylamide materials. Sometimes you'll see people referring to gypsum as a soil additive. It's really an amendment. Gypsum's often added to soils for a stabilization purpose. In general, stay away from anything that doesn't seem like you should be adding it to the soil. If you don't want to add it to your body, don't add it to the soil.
I love it. I love it. Okay. And in that regard, one thing that we have had questions about was biosolids, right? Which is sort of going back to what we learned many years ago, that biosolids are the final, sort of the end of the wastewater treatment process. So biosolids do contain metals, and we know now that they also contain often levels of the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances that are currently being investigated because they can migrate through the soil into the groundwater and contaminate the groundwater beneath. And so we have advised that biosolids not be used for amendments to gardens. There is evidence of uptake of certainly the PFAS into some of the plants. Data are accumulating now. So I think it's wise what we found and what we've worked with Vidya on, which is to say no thank you to the biosolids until we know a little bit more about them.
For urban gardening, yeah.
Yes, for urban gardening, and for the backyard gardener, whether they're urban or they're rural, that no need to bring that in when there is access to other sources of nitrogen and phosphorus.
Yeah, it does. I will say it feels cruel when a neighbor will say, "Hey, I have a compost pile going. Can I give it to you guys for the community garden?" What we do recommend to them is we direct them to the city, and the city can actually use them for street plantings rather than in community gardens.
Right. So actually, Vidya, I have a question about chemical pesticides. We've gotten questions from people who are in community gardens where the rules are such that we should not be using chemical pesticides, but there are people who are using them. And what's your approach to addressing this problem in terms of either education or other programming, speaking to people, the garden chair, whoever, about not bringing in chemical pesticides?
Yeah, that can be a tough one, but I think the message comes better from a peer in the garden than from the land trust as the landowner. I will share that. So the way our gardens are set up right now, the day-to-day management is really done by local self-selected volunteers. So let's say one of the gardens has two neighbors that work together to organize plot requests, plot designations, rules, etc. So we as landowners provide the rules, which are posted on the garden, which do include no chemical pesticides at all. And then the enforcement is done by our volunteers. And you will get one or two folks who defy you, but I think a little bit of coaching or guidance by their fellow gardeners just while they're in the garden goes a very long way. But please do post the rules because, and if you can, in multiple languages.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move over back to Patrick on this issue of compost that comes up time and time again. Is there a definition of compost?
So compost is actually more regulated than soil in the United States, believe it or not. That's really come out, I think, of the municipal industry getting into composting. And you now have several universities that offer certificates in composting. One of the first was the University of Maine that offered a certificate a couple of decades ago now. They started doing this in large municipal scale composting. So that definition will differ in the state you're in. And how it's regulated can even differ within the community you live in, within Pennsylvania, for instance. You will have private entities offering compost services in my area, and then you have a municipal source too. And it hasn't got to the point where they're offering data to back up whose compost is better, but you will see that in some areas. You actually are starting to see some urban gardening operations and high-end community supported agricultural type of operations showing their testing information as proof of, what proof of purchase, I guess is what you would say, to show that what they're doing is what they say. And you can see it in the soil test. You can see it's a healthy soil. You can see this is what our compost has in it and what it does not have in it. And they show you exactly what the tests were they used and what those tests should tell you. So just because something's not in a compost or in a soil that's been tested doesn't mean it's not there. You have to be careful that the test that was used was a test that was appropriate to tell you if it was there. That's critical.
So the other thing, Patrick, then that we've been dealing with is, you have these piles of compost in a lot somewhere, and you get a test result, and you're asked to, understand I'll say the homogeneity of a heterogeneous compost pile by a single test, right? And so the question also goes back to your QA/QC, and what were the criteria that you're using to evaluate that very large pile of compost? And will the purveyors hold on to that pile in time for you to review the information, or have they already moved that pile off their lot, which is what they need to do? So it's good to have the data, but it's also good to understand, as you pointed out, how the data are collected, who has the data, and what they're used for. So there are a couple of questions in the chat that I think we've answered in the chat, but I think a couple of them are important to raise. One of them is somebody actually had questions about rooftop gardens. And in the chat, there's information about some links, but also it's critical the roof can support the weight of the rooftop gardens. And we actually found that in Boston, that the first one that we had, maybe it didn't support it so well. And as Vidya points out, there's a lot of sun up there. It's pretty dry, and you're going to have to make sure that you account for the weight with the water that you're going to have to add as well. So that's important. Let's see, another question or point made by Ann Carroll, who is in the Brownfields program at EPA, points out that clean fill doesn't mean safe to grow. And that's important as well. Let's see, other questions or anything I think that the panel would like to, either Patrick or Vidya would like to bring up that we haven't touched on.
There's a question here that came about urban pests like rats or pigeons.
Oh.
So rats, it's site maintenance, site habits. You want to have a clean site. So that's picking up after yourself, not attracting pests by leaving food out. If the rats are going after the garden items, you're going to have to deal something with the rat. You have to deal somehow with those rats to get rid of them. And that's really up to your community gardening group to figure out how you want to do that. Live trapping of rats does not work well. I know that from experience. And once you have rats, it's not that it's very hard to get rid of. It's just you're going to have rats. If you have them, you're going to keep having them because they're in the area and they breed voraciously. Pigeons, there's different strategies to deal with pigeons. Some people have had luck dealing with or using those fake owls. Some people use certain call boxes that emit a sound, but that's not always good in urban area because of the neighbors. And you can come out and find your call box smashed to the ground one night or one morning when you come out to the garden. Netting is a solution, but pigeons will get caught in the netting. So you can target the netting maybe to your high value. If you've got raspberry crops, that would be a high value crop, berry crops, strawberries. I honestly haven't seen many problems with pigeons going after garden product. It's more crows, grackles. Those are the big problems. Crows, especially in the fall when they flock, can decimate a garden in minutes.
So I'm going to move on here. I had missed some of the questions in the Q&A. I apologize. Vidya mentioned that it's important to get buy-in from local government partners and their staff when setting up sites and establishing soil compost testing. How do you do that? Is there a lot of pushback, or are officials receptive or excited about community gardens?
I would say in our case, we're lucky they are receptive because, I think you have to plan for building the political support. That can be a time suck, but it is time really well spent, because if the mayor's supporting you, the legislative staff will, as well the staff, in the various offices. What I will say is, in Boston, for lack of other partner groups, it has fallen to the trustees, and we're happy to play this role, but it is somebody in a city has to play this role, which is there are three parties here to hold accountability. One is the city, one is the contractor who contracts with the city, and then the environmental group that is reviewing these results that we do annually, because you have to be very, very careful, just like everybody said, of what you're accepting, and really does impact this huge group of gardeners. And the city, unfortunately, doesn't do it for us, but we then contract out. So, with groups like the BU School of Public Health, so that we're actually getting professionals' feedback on if they're agreeing on how the testing was done and what those test results really mean.
It varies so much
right now. Yeah, it can be
Yeah.
complicated. Test, I look at it and I'm like, well, I get this, but half the report I sent to Wendy, I'm like, I don't know what this means. So you really do need that. And I think in Boston, the different environmental groups, the different community garden owners, as including the Parks Department, surprisingly, are looking to us to interpret these soil results and make sure that we're getting the right soil in. And this really also harbors on the trust between the city officials and that contractor and you, right? So you're selecting piles, you're making sure you're getting the same pile. It can be tough sometimes. It really depends on the contractor.
Even the groups who are involved in Detroit, you can have private organizations now that own large amounts of land because they've bought up these areas thinking that redevelopment might happen down the road. But for now, they're leasing these lands to people who want to have farms in Detroit. Or there's places you can go in Detroit where you won't see a car all day. There's this abandoned lots. In Pittsburgh, you deal with an urban redevelopment authority. In Philadelphia, you deal with either the Parks and Rec Department now, which is allocating land in the city, and they're working in conjunction with the Soil Safety Working Group, which is a combination of government officials and citizens from NGOs.
Okay, really important stuff. A few more questions. I see we're at the top of the hour, but we'll take a few more. Here's one. Mercury is a concern in former or current mining areas, but what about land in the wind shadow of a coal-fired power plant? And to what extent is that a concern for uptake into plants? So in your work, Patrick, have you worked on mercury?
So mercury in urban soils is more of a problem at depth if there's a source of mercury from some type of historical storage or usage on a property site. So railroad yards are a site where I run the mercury a lot. At the surface, a lot of mercury will photovolatilize when sunlight hits it. So it vaporizes and doesn't become a problem. Dilution's the solution to pollution, or sometimes just vaporizing it. Other times, mercury, if soil becomes saturated, the mercury will change form and mobilize with the water and exit the site or go to a deeper depth. So most of the sites I've worked on, we've not had mercury problems. Maybe Ann
So
can
on the mercury and the power plants, I think there are sort of I would say a scarcity of data around the deposition areas for the power plants, looking specifically at that question.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Right. I think that the data are the data are not there to answer that question specifically, but they are there for some of the mercury mining sites.
Well, I'll give you an example. So if you're in a city where there was a coal-powered structure, furnace, a small foundry, people burn coal everywhere. So what we did research in Linfen City, China, the most polluted city in the world, and we did these transects going away from stacks on the site. And you can see trends on the stacks path that correlate with the historic wind direction. Right. So if you're on the opposite side of the stack, it's not a problem. But if you're working on that side of the stack with those soils, you might have mercury pollution over there. And it depends on stack height. Stack heights used to be a lot shorter than they are today.
Right. And the other piece about that question is in terms of uptake, right? But what we've really seen is that those who have studied uptake into plants, and there are a number of groups working on mining sites, Superfund research program grants as well, programs in New Mexico. But those who have looked specifically at metals in brownfield sites, for example, have really focused on the metals that are most commonly found and not so much on the mercury. So, but we cannot, I don't think the data exist, but we do know that for those commonly found metals, takes an awful lot to get it taken up into plants. There may be some deposition on the root itself, the root structure. So washing the plants is important before eating, but actual uptake, at least for the lead and the arsenic and the cadmium, again, pH dependent, but also not very bioaccessible into the plant itself. I guess we can keep going. A question about what's the best thing to do with weeds? Oh, actually, I stand corrected. Mercury in coniferous trees, University of Washington has published on storage in needles. So we'll get that and get that posted. Thank you very much to Lynn Patrick. Question about what to do with weeds. Will the city compost heat hot enough to deactivate seeds?
So one of the ways that we've suggested people start dealing with weeds in urban gardens is flame weeding rather than putting them in any compost. Because like Maria was shaking her head, you don't want to put weeds in your compost if you have a small gardening operation, because you're just not going to generate the temperatures to get rid of the weeds. And you can avoid pesticides by just getting a small flame weeder. Sometimes a simple propane torch is enough, but that's wasteful because you're going to go through the canister too quick. If you get a propane gas canister weeder, you can buy the attachment to the gas canister online from several different places, and you're not going to burn down the neighborhood. You're just essentially desiccating the weed, and it dies there in the garden bed. And it's no chemical. It's a fossil fuel, but it's better than using a herbicide.
Okay. I think in the interest of people's time, we're going to stop there. I want to thank everybody, and Hannah, I think we'll thank, and we can answer the Q&As offline. I guess we've done that before.
Yes, yeah. Feel free to send your questions. I have a list of them in emails that I'll get a report for, and we can follow up with questions that were asked that we couldn't get to today. Go ahead, Patrick.
I just wanted to add one more practice that we started telling people in Philly and Pittsburgh is vacuum out your car floors regularly. because you'd be surprised the amount of dust tracked into the garden that gets accumulated on those floors. And if the kids are playing on the floor in the back of the car and there's lead dust, that can actually set off the test at the doctor when they're looking for lead accumulation in the hair sample.
Oh, that's hair sample.
Yeah, that's one of the quickest ways they do rather than a
Oh my
blood test.
God.
That's how
Oh
they
my
found the
God.
Palmerton lead levels, was hair tests.
Yeah, well, it's like a little too late.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of you for taking time today to speak. We're approaching the end of the webinar. A video recording will be available on the CHE website soon. Tomorrow you'll receive an email containing the link to the recording, as well as the survey that Wendy mentioned. Please take a few minutes to complete the survey so that we can tailor future webinars to your interests. CHE's next webinar from the CHE-Alaska Partnership will take place tomorrow, March 31st, and is titled Plastics, Endocrine Disrupting Chemicals in Health, Findings of a New Joint Report on the Endocrine Society and International Pollutants Elimination Network, or IPEN. You can RSVP through CHE's website at healthandenvironment.org. If you are new to CHE and would like to stay updated about upcoming events or more, please sign up to receive our newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website. Additionally, if you appreciate these CHE Partnership webinars bringing the latest environmental health research for free, we encourage you to support CHE's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. With that, I would like to thank our speakers, Patrick and Vidya, for taking time to present today, and Wendy for your excellent moderation, and Maria too for helping organize this webinar. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, stay well and healthy.